There's David Thorpe. Good morning, everyone. This is Bring It In, our From Quarantine Troop Show. And hey, look, live from London, there's Catherine Belton. I wonder if she can hear us yet. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
No, thank you. So I didn't even realize it was Zoom. So are we audio only, or is it all?
No, everyone can see you. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
And we're live. People are watching right now, just so if you have any embarrassing things to say, this would not be a good time. Catherine, this is your book. It's 620 something pages.
It's 24.
My arms got tired holding it up at night. So heavy. I can only imagine the work that went into it. How long did it take you to write?
A really long time, partly through my own inefficiency, but also because it just took a long time to research and write. So it was 6-7 years, I'm afraid to say. It was a long
So that's
time.
about 100 pages a year.
Yeah. Apart from it didn't quite work like that. Most of the time was spent researching and then scrambled to get it done and written at the end. First too densely, then too lengthily, and then hopefully just right. So we'll see. But it's not quite 624 pages, because actually the text is only 500 pages and the rest is footnotes. So it's not really that long at all.
I'm curious to know what your typical day was like while writing it. But first, Henry, why don't you give us her amazing background?
Let's embarrass you a little bit. Catherine Belton is an investigative correspondent for Reuters. She worked from 2007 to 2013 as the Moscow correspondent of the Financial Times. In 2016, as the newspaper's legal correspondent, she's previously reported on Russia for Moscow Times and Business Week. In 2009, she was shortlisted for Business Journalist of the Year at the British Press Awards. She lives in London. And I'll just keep reading a little bit. How about this review? The cast of supporting characters in Catherine Belton's study of Russia, of Vladimir Putin, is extraordinary and worthy of a Netflix miniseries. This is modern Russia in full, horrifying Technicolor. In Putin's People, Belton, a former FT Moscow correspondent, leaves no stone unturned in her exposition of how the Russian president and his people dominate the largest country on earth and how they have come to do so. This riveting, immaculately researched book is arguably the best single volume written about Putin, the people around him, and perhaps even about contemporary Russia itself in the past 3 decades. That's from Peter, I don't know how to say his last name, Frankopan? Is that how you say it?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I was the That's a really good review. Oh my goodness. And there are 10 more like it, 15 more like it. You must be very pleased with that.
Yeah, it's incredible to get such reviews. I was really blown away by them, actually. It kind of made it feel worthwhile.
I can imagine.
So what was a typical day as you did this? I'm sure it wasn't just writing, as you were investigating and talking to people all the time, but give us a glimpse, if you wouldn't mind, of what a typical Monday through Friday looked like for you.
Yeah, I'm afraid it was pretty much divided between sort of quite a few years, maybe 4 years of just doing research and making sure my notes were typed up so that I could remember everything, and then pretty much straight boring writing, sort of getting up as early as possible and sitting down, sometimes not getting dressed and just writing, trying to get the thing done. So it wasn't particularly creative, but I did spend far too long researching, because it was just so much fun and such a great sort of hunt to be on, trying to put this great story together about kind of what happened to Russia and how come we ended up with the security services so powerful ruling the country right now. So yeah, I was really trying to examine what happened at the fall of the Soviet Union and how the security services had been able to remain in the shadows, in the background, and then so effectively take control of the country and then expand to try and reassert sort of power and kind of authority in the rest of the world as well.
I feel like to the extent that I've talked to Russian people, they're just think it's hilarious how poorly we Americans understand Russia, and the CNN version is all wrong, and the Fox News version is all wrong, and every version's wrong. And I what are we getting wrong? Like, what is Russia like that we're just getting wrong?
I think it's difficult. I mean, you have to spend a long time sort of like talking to people. You have to spend a long time sort of speaking to as many different players as possible, from all sides of the spectrum. But kind of mainly what I would say, what was wrong in the kind of the Western understanding of Putin's Russia was this sort of focus on it just being a kleptocracy, that Putin and his security services allies, that when they were sort of taking over sectors of the economy, that they were just doing so to line their own pockets. It was just because they were greedy. And there was a lot, when I was at the FT in Moscow, there was a lot of focus on sort of Russian corruption. We'd always get front page stories on sort of Russian corruption scandals, but there was very little focus on corruption in the West itself. And this was the kind of the crucial oversight, which in many ways kind of allowed Putin and his men to really kind of expand Russia's influence in the West, because no one was really paying attention to what lawyers and bankers and other people were doing in the West, and indeed politicians who were steadily being corrupted by this huge kind of inflow of Russian cash that was coming into the West, and largely not controlled by independent oligarchs as we're used to seeing them as being, but by oligarchs who sort of by 2008 were largely under the control of the Kremlin, that the Putin security men had been able to sort of win control of the Russian court system and law enforcement, and the security services by then sort of wielded such power that most of the oligarchs that we were used to thinking of being uber powerful in the Yeltsin era were essentially becoming arms of the Kremlin, that they had to carry out strategic tasks for the Kremlin. Like one such oligarch who made all his money in the 90s basically said, look, after 2008, we were bailed out by the Kremlin after the financial crisis. And once you've been bailed out by the Kremlin, that's it. If you get a call from the Kremlin saying you have to spend 1 billion or 2 billion on this or that strategic project, you can't say no, you have to comply. So there are just so many ways that Putin's men can exert leverage over the Russian billionaires and the businessmen. There is obviously, as you know, there's a widespread system of compromat. Putin's security men have their ears everywhere. When I was reporting there, even in like 2012, 2011, like the businessmen that I'd go and speak to were always like paranoid. They'd make me leave my phone outside the office. Instead of talking about Putin, they'd point to the ceiling. You know, he was the number one, he was the boss, and people were just very, very much aware that what they were speaking about was recorded, and that there were sort of many ways that the security services could gather intelligence on them. And also because sort of the financial system, like the banking system, also became very much dominated by the state banks, that eventually the Russian tycoons were also dependent on a nod from Putin or just other people in the Kremlin in order to gain access to financing. It became a situation where if you want to do any deal, you need the nod from the number one.
Wow. So we got one of those. We got one of those in the NBA. Around about, I think in 2007, Mikhail Prokhorov bought the Nets. I should know that fact. I think that's when it was. So it's roughly on that schedule that you're talking about. He's in the book. You know a lot about him, and you sort of, when we talked in advance, you mentioned that his schooling at the Moscow Finance Institute was important. That he went there. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, Moscow Finance Institute. It's kind of like, you know, it's like Harvard, or it's like Russia's version of Harvard. It's the most prestigious kind of financial academy in the Soviet Union in those days, and in Russia nowadays. It was kind of, you know, Prokhorov was part of Moscow's so-called golden youth. He was brought up in a very sort of prestigious family. He had everything he needed, and he also went to the most prestigious financial institute. It's kind of a training ground for future oligarchs and also for government officials. It was the sort of the well-connected place to be. Very often, of course, those who went there were also recruited by the KGB in those days, or the security services, as the KGB began making preparations really for a transition to a market economy. They recruited many sort of young entrepreneurial types like Prokhorov to begin moving money into the West.
And he did go to some kind of banking job after that. It's not, as I
Yeah.
recall, he had a boring banking job, and then they started a bank with this. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I mean, first of all, for a while, like many of these sort of young entrepreneurs in the late 80s, he began sort of on the lower end of the scale. He was selling stonewashed jeans
Right.
with his friend and classmate of the time, a guy called Irakli Kavaladze, who no doubt you will have come
We'll
across
come
as
back.
the mysterious eighth man in the Trump Tower meeting with
Right.
Natalia Veselnitska and all those guys, whatever they were doing that strange day of June 2016. But so he was very close with Kavaladze. They had this small kind of business. How long they remained partners for exactly is anyone's guess. But he ended up running and moving very fast to head a very prestigious banking institute called the International Finance Corporation, which had its headquarters in the main banking street of Moscow. It was sort of, it used to be home to the biggest Soviet state banks, but very soon after the fall of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Prokhorov was ensconced in one of these enormous, not quite skyscrapers, but certainly very imposing buildings in the center of Moscow. And he soon teamed up with another member of Moscow's golden youth, Vladimir Potanin, whose father was a diplomat. He'd also gone to one of the most prestigious universities in Moscow, and he was very much kind of steered as well, and deals were steered Potanin's way by an elite kind of part of the Soviet security services and the kind of progressive part of the intelligence community, who were very much trying to steer the country towards a market economy, because they knew the Soviet planned economy was never going to be competitive with the West. So they were kind of putting their men in place of various bits of the banking sector and the economy.
And do we take, is it at this point, is intelligence part of what's going on? Do you know what I mean?
Well, I'm not sure. So it's kind of well known and well established in sort of and also in my book reporting that basically there was a foreign intelligence arm of the KGB was much more kind of progressive and sort of a much more widely traveled than most of the rest of the KGB, who of course were the sort of meathead, knucklehead types at home who were just in charge of clamping down on dissidents. But the foreign intelligence arm had traveled widely. They could see that the Soviet planned economy was never going to be able to catch up with the West unless they made this kind of jump to the market transition. So essentially what they did a couple of things. First, they began sort of sponsoring and helping open sort of various institutes in Moscow where the first kind of perestroika reforms under Gorbachev were drafted. And then they also began recruiting students. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the former owner of UKOS, was one of them. These were members of the Communist Youth League. Some of them, like Khodorkovsky, they came from ethnic minority backgrounds, so they were sort of rebelling against the system, and they knew that in the standard Soviet system they were going to hit a ceiling pretty soon, so they were quite easy to recruit and sort of give new opportunities and allowed to basically become first black market entrepreneurs, and then sort of progressively given access to sort of ruble cash that they were able to convert and then begin trading in commodities. And it was very much the sense that when I talked to these oligarchs and some of their partners at the time, that they wouldn't have been able to make their way in business without a helping hand from these progressive elements within the KGB. And sort of given Prokhorov's own position, and sort of he was at a great advantage compared to the likes of Khodorkovsky, because he had, he was ethnic Russia and he had a very sort of prestigious upbringing, but he wouldn't have been able to make his way in business in the late 80s without a certain helping hand from those progressive elements, because you couldn't do any deals, you couldn't get banking licenses without sort of so-called handlers in those type of security services. But obviously this, for the security service, for the progressive elements in the KGB, this was it was an experiment in the market, and they had this sort of petri dish of of young entrepreneurs that they were giving deals to, allowing them to make money as they gradually tried to arrange this transition to the market. But this was an experiment that sort of, as the 90s progressed, it span out to the control of the KGB after Yeltsin came to power, and the young tycoons were able to access Russian government accounts and become more and more wealthy and powerful in their own right. So I don't think Prokhorov was in any means an intelligence agent, but he was certainly helped along his way in the beginning by those types.
When you mentioned, Catherine, you mentioned after the financial crisis and the oligarchs needed a bailout from the government, and if they didn't cooperate after they got the bailout, what were the ramifications of that? And I'm wondering too, Henry likes to talk about, we have a lot of MBA owners that are billionaires. Our country won't acknowledge who got the bailout, so they're not, at least not as much as we're hoping. Do you see any kind of connection there that as to why they may be keeping it secret in the first place?
Oh gosh, I'm not sure. I don't know about the MBA billionaires in your country, unfortunately, but I know.
No, I know, I get that. I understood that part. Yeah.
I know the ones in Russia. So I mean, essentially, this tycoon, he put it very bluntly. So he had been sort of exposed, sort of in the run up to the 2008 financial crisis. A lot of the Yeltsin era tycoons, they borrowed very heavily from Western banks. They were in like massive expansion phase. Oil prices had been rising, and there was a real kind of like gold rush going on in Moscow, and they were sort of also expanding internationally, but mostly it had been funded by Western banks. So when all of a sudden the liquidity dried up and the stock prices were crashing, they were all facing margin calls from the Western banks, and the Western banks had as collateral the stakes in all these Russian oligarchs' empires. And of course, it was something that the Kremlin couldn't contemplate, that Western banks could start picking off these businesses and taking stakes in strategic enterprises, like whether it be metals companies, like in the case of Prokhorov, or telecoms. So the Kremlin organized state banks to bail them out. But sort of already at this point, the oligarchs knew that they were beholden to the Kremlin, that already there was one of Prokhorov's business partners basically summed it up when I was interviewing him in 2007. This was Oleg Deripaska. He said basically, even at that point, he said, if Putin's state tells us we should give it up, my company will give it up. We're not going to fight like Khodorkovsky did, because basically they'd already watched Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Russia's one-time richest man, go to jail for 10 years. His oil company had been taken over by the Russian state, basically because he'd refused to toe the Kremlin lines. He'd refused to kind of buckle down. The Kremlin believed he posed a political challenge, and Khodorkovsky just kept up his independent rhetoric and kept up sort of trying to align himself with the US over the Kremlin, and he faced the consequences. So it's a very clear signal to the rest of the oligarchs. But this was a process that deepened after the 2008 financial crisis, when they were so dependent on state loans. Now, Prokhorov, he was a little bit different, because he had managed, he was the only one who had any cash left after the financial crisis of 2008, because he'd sold out of his biggest holding, which is a metals company, Norilsk Nickel, in the summer of 2008, just before the crash began. And he'd sold out his stake in Norilsk Nickel for $10 billion. So he was like the last man standing, and he was the only one with any cash. So they were all running to him, actually asking for.
Well, it was dumb luck because of the Courchevel scandal, right?
Yeah. So yeah, he had been, of course, in trouble. His partner of business partner of, by that time, I think sort of 11 or 12 years, or maybe less, 15 years, Vladimir Potanin, this other guy he was friends with from Moscow for a long time. Their relations were becoming increasingly edgy, and the story goes that his business partner Vladimir Potanin, essentially, he set him up because he wanted Prokhorov out of his business, and he wanted this huge metal a mining giant called Norilsk Nickel for himself. And so it's kind of a well-established practice in Russian billionaire circles that you kind of go around with lots of girls, and
We'll talk more about that.
they might not be, we don't know, but they're kind of famous for hosting kind of very indulgent and excessive parties. And so Prokhorov was well known for sort of flying around Russia and other places with plane loads of girls. And at some point, it seems Potanin decided to stitch him up. And in 2007, I think Prokhorov was arrested briefly in the French ski resort of Courchevel, and sort of charged, he was investigated for running a prostitution ring for all these plane loads of girls that he took with him everywhere. So this began a process of this great split up with Potanin. He believed Potanin had set him up. He denied, of course, that they were prostitutes. But it began a long process. But in those days, in 2007, Russian oligarchs were still fighting. Nowadays, you don't hear a squeak out of them. There's barely any deals going on. But in those days, there were these huge kind of oligarch clashes still going on as they were fighting between themselves and carving up business empires. And so Prokhorov was kind of able to fight back a bit against Potanin and sort of leverage other holdings by kind of, it's a complicated game, but it's sort of like watching Billionaires, your series where people are up to all kinds of Machiavellian games, and he managed to kind of bring in other rivals to put Potanin in an uncomfortable position on something else. So in the end, by the time he did sell out of Norilsk Nickel, as Potanin had always been aiming, he managed to sell out for a huge amount of money, for 10 billion at the top of the market, and he sold out to Potanin's worst enemy. So he actually turned the tables on Potanin completely, and for a while, he was sitting pretty. He had loads of cash, and he was also very much on the side of the Russian president of the time, the more liberal Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, whose rule was short, but he was definitely aligning himself with him.
So that's Prokhorov said many sort of openly pro-Western things and about opening Russia, and then he ran for president. How do we understand that?
Yeah, I think Prokhorov, he does represent this more kind of liberal wing of the Russian elite, and it was clear that he was aligning himself with Dmitry Medvedev, who was Russia's president from 2008 to 2012. He was the so-called placeholder president, which allowed Putin to return. But during those kind of brief 4 years, he did sort of talk the talk, the liberal talk, and there was a lot of hope among some of the Yeltsin era tycoons that there might be kind of some kind of liberalization of the market, that some of Putin's sort of hard men, the so-called siloviki, the men of force who were expanding their tentacles like everywhere, would be kind of reined in. Prokhorov was certainly, I think, trying to take advantage of that too. He was close with the Yeltsin family, the Yeltsin's daughter in particular, and I think they would sort of try to work together to try and kind of induce a more kind of progressive and liberal policy in Russia. And I think when so Putin obviously quickly put an end to that, because the so-called men of force, the security men, their interests were getting sort of quashed too much and too hard by Medvedev. He was trying to kick them out of juicy positions at big state companies. He was trying to privatize some of the big state companies. And so I think these men of force persuaded Putin that Medvedev had gone too far, that Putin had to return in 2012. Medvedev Medvedev was being too openly cultivated by the US, like President Obama had been making a beeline for him over Putin. They'd been eating hamburgers together in Washington, D.C. or
We can't have the
wherever.
hamburgers. No, that's too far.
Yeah, you can't let that happen, of course. And also the fact of abstaining over the use of force in Libya was perhaps more important than the hamburgers. But at the same, so Putin was persuaded that he had to return in 2012. Medvedev was swept aside, but Prokhorov for a while sort of kept holding the lantern for this kind of more progressive section of the Kremlin, and for a while he was tolerated. He was allowed to run for the presidency in 2012. Putin probably allowed him to run as an outlet as a vent for this kind of more progressive section of the elite, which had thought it was going to be in power for another 4 years under Medvedev until Putin put the end to this. But I think they picked and allowed Prokhorov to do this because, of the way he'd acquired his assets in the 90s, the privatizations in which he'd acquired prime industrial assets for a knockdown price, meant that he was never going to be popular enough among the population to ever pose a real challenge to Putin. So he was kind of like the liberal force that was tolerated because they knew he was never going to win. But I think he did believe in this. He was openly critical of Putin. He kept saying that we need more competition in the economy. That Putin's hold on power has gone on for too long. 12 years is long enough. I mean, this is 2011. He's saying 12 years is long enough, and now we're at 20 years. And of course, we don't hear anyone dare to say those words anymore. But then it was a different matter, and he was running very openly on a platform of saying Putin has been long enough in power. But then, as I said, he didn't really stand a chance. He came in third. He participated in some of the opposition protests. He was the only Russian billionaire to sort of openly take part in them. He spoke at some of the protest meetings. So for a while, he really had his head over the parapet. But lately he's very quiet because I think after Putin annexed Crimea in 2014, the peninsula, which did belong to Ukraine, basically his security men have gained in standing, and these more progressive voices have been sort of increasingly sidelined. And as one other Russian tycoon put it to me in 2014, it's like, you really do, it's really a war economy. Like everything, it can be considered Putin's now. You have to put your entire company's assets on Putin's balance sheet. So if you're told to pay, you have to pay, or you have to do deals in which you share with Putin's men, or you follow orders. Otherwise, you lose your assets.
Wow.
Somewhere in there, he starts having various sports ventures. I know he's involved in the Biathlon Union and Cheska, and then the Brooklyn Nets. What is the role of sports in this?
I think sports, again, it's part of to some degree, it's part of a KGB tradition as well. Like in the Soviet period, like sports were a great way of sort of traveling, recruiting people, like having great events of hospitality and so on. And it's a good way for perhaps the more independent type tycoons like Prokhorov to show their support for the Russian state, for the Kremlin, like within Russia itself. Like in the run up to the Winter Olympics, Prokhorov was also sort of doing his bit for the Kremlin by funding the Russian biathlon team, the Olympic biathlon team. He's spending like $2 million a year on providing them with equipment and training and so on. And I think probably his purchase of the Nets, I mean, that was 2009. Again, that was a different era than it is now. I think probably, he's very tall. He likes basketball. I think he genuinely wished to purchase a basketball team for himself. but probably as time goes on and you're more and more beholden to the Kremlin on this, according to this process that I've been describing, in particular, kind of, while in 2009, perhaps he was a bit freer of the Kremlin than the others because he had so much more cash. That's certainly not the case now, and you don't hear anything political from him at all now. He's very quiet, and probably he has to pay his dues like everyone else. I mean, he was always, one example, for instance, he was always very close to Suleiman Kerimov. That's another Russian tycoon who was sort of exposed in the Panama Papers, the International Consortium of International Journalists, kind of offshore leaks. And Suleiman Kerimov was kind of found to be essentially making $200 million in payments to one of Putin's front men, like his closest school friend, in this like huge offshore slush fund. And Kerimov, Prokhorov, they've always gone together. They've always shared businesses, swapped assets. So I presume, I'm not saying this is true, but I presume it's an example where sort of Russian billionaires, they pay tribute to the Tsar. You put some money in the slush fund, and I'm presuming Prokhorov is doing that now. I don't know, MBA, I think probably for him began as a personal thing, but perhaps at some point it became also useful strategically for the Kremlin as an influence operation. I'm not sure, because I actually haven't done any reporting on what he was doing with the NBA, but I'm sure at some point it became useful for kind of cozying up to other American billionaires, or perhaps to Donald Trump. I mean, who knows?
There have been so many. There was one sort of outrageous moment of this was as Putin talks about offshoring, right? It's a very stressful point for Russia about this this topic of offshoring assets, and Prokhorov has a very prominent offshore asset, right? And so I'm sort of surprising you with this, but but there's a moment where Prokhorov stands next to Putin and they talk about how he's going to move the nets to Moscow, the front office part, and they're like, yes, we will move the nets back, and then I mean, I talked to them, they're like, no, nobody ever even made a phone call inquiring about that. Like it was just a press call.
Yeah, I guess it's sometimes these things, if it's on TV, it's just for show, and you have to say, yes, of course, I'm going to do that, even though it's completely unrealistic. And obviously Putin, despite all his talk about bringing money from offshore, onshore, I think, most of his closest allies, as we've seen in the Panama Papers revelations, are actually behind some of the biggest outflows of cash and some of the most complex money laundering schemes. And indeed, there's a whole unit of the FSB, the Federal Security Services, which oversees like tens of billions of dollars worth of money laundering schemes, that they're tolerating it, they're taking a cut, but they're also using these schemes, such as the Deutsche Bank mirror trades, as a funnel for kind of sending their own cash for intelligence operations into the West and other places. It's cash to buy off and corrupt politicians in the West, but they can use these huge money laundering schemes, some of which we've seen in the Deutsche Bank mirror trades, and there's the well-known so-called Moldovan laundromat, in which there's a lot of cash that's used, that's leaving Russia as customs and tax evasion, but within it there's a very steady stream of cash that's emanating and overseen by the FSB, and sort of numerous bankers have told me about that, and it's there as a stream of cash to start infiltrating our Western democracies. So I don't know, again, with Prokhorov, to what degree he may or may not be involved in that, it's an open question. But as we've discussed before, he did have a very interesting classmate, Irakli Kavaladze,
Yes.
who was certainly up to his ears initially in some of those schemes.
Can you tell? So I don't know much about him. I know that he at one point, well, they went to school together, and at one point Prokhorov was purchasing Stillwater Mining, giant American, maybe the biggest mining company, and it didn't happen, I think, but the proposal was that Kavaladze would be the person representing Prokhorov on the board of this American publicly traded mining company, and it didn't happen, but it was a confirmation that they remained close many years
Yeah.
after school, I suppose.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it's kind of curious because there's no way that Kavaladze would have even been nominated to that board if he hadn't maintained some kind of close relationship with Prokhorov. And it was very curious in that his nomination was forwarded just 3 years after Kavaladze had been implicated in this huge money laundering scandal in the U.S. when essentially like House investigators had uncovered how he was moving. I think it was two billion through hundreds of accounts. Thousands of accounts in the US, including in Citibank, this bank called the Commercial Bank of San Francisco. And the money was being moved by Kavaladze from 94 onwards in very suspicious manner. In those days, the US banking regulations were very lax, to say the least, and Citibank admitted that very often it hadn't been told, or nor had it been asked sort of who or what was the business activity behind this money being moved. And Kavaladze would often tell them that he didn't know, but because Kavaladze had somehow mysteriously won US citizenship, I think it was 92 or 93, when he was adopted by a US citizen at the ripe old age of 30, a very
Wait, really? That's what happened?
Indeed. So quite and who by a woman who mysteriously died a year later. So
Wow.
he was able to open accounts at US banks without any questions asked at all, and he was also in business with a well-known former KGB officer in Latvia, and Latvia was very often the first jumping off point for this kind of huge flow of money that was emanating from Russia. And I was told by another former Kremlin insider that this was part of a flow of funds connected to a security service slush fund involving kind of exemptions for tobacco and kind of alcohol imports, that this thing called a national sports fund was running, but it was essentially run by the security services, and they were moving money en masse into the West to secure themselves and goodness knows what else from 94 onwards under Yeltsin. And Kavaladze was certainly in the thick of it, but yeah, he has a very curious backstory indeed. Like I mentioned, his adoption, so he studied in the same class with Prokhorov, and then soon after traveled to the US, where he was he was studying. He spent some time in Gettysburg, became close to this family where he first traveled there at the age of 28, and 2 years later he's adopted under circumstances which have yet to be fully explained, because as I mentioned, the mother unfortunately died, and the rest of the family just haven't been commenting on how it was. But so he'd been implicated in this investigation by Congress into the money laundering scheme, in which they were calling Congress, as a result of its investigations, in which they'd very clearly shown Kavaladze moving all this money, they'd called for greater regulation of the correspondent banking system. He was named in all kinds of press reports, and yet still Prokhorov, as you say, was nominating him to the board of Stillwater, this huge mining giant. So yeah, it's curious, but obviously someone later probably belatedly realized that they might be exposing themselves, and that's why it didn't happen. But yeah, I'd be curious to know more about the relationship and how enduring it has been. And Kavaladze, again, I forgot to mention, he was working at the time of the money laundering scandal very closely with Aras Agalarov, the very well-known Moscow construction tycoon who ran the infamous Miss Universe 2013 beauty contest, where Trump may or may not have been kind of compromised.
So I wanted to ask about that, actually. The other day, you may know this, Catherine, President Trump basically wished Miss Maxwell, Epstein's kind of chief recruiter, he wished her well. And earlier you mentioned the role that women tend to be around oligarchs frequently. And Henry's said that before to me and written it before. What's the role of women in, I guess you call it the hospitality industry? What's your thoughts on that? What do you know about that?
Yeah, well, Russian billionaires, they are famous for their hospitality. And so, unfortunately, it has been the Soviet KGB. There was another, the former chief executive of Norilsk Nickel, another former Prokhorov-owned company, a big metals mining giant. His name was Vladimir Strajolkovsky, and he used to head the tourist ministry and was very closely linked with the KGB. And I've been told by various sources that he was kind of expert in the placing of bugs in hotel rooms and so on. So this is a practice that has gone back many decades. And the Russian billionaires, I've been to a couple of Russian billionaire parties when I was a Moscow correspondent, and yes, there are always swarms of girls everywhere. There was one particular party, and I won't mention the name of the oligarch, but he always used to invite lots of Western bankers. They were doing lots of this. These were in the days when Western bankers did a lot of business in Russia. They were trying to make Moscow, transform it into a so-called international financial center. And the real aim was to bring sort of the top Western bankers to Russia. And this was in the days when Lloyd Blankfein, the chairman of Goldman Sachs, would come and visit these Russian tycoons, and John Mack was very cozy with them. These sort of real leading lights would come out to Moscow. But at the parties, there was always a so-called Kremlin pimp, and there was a man who was sort of officially known as the Kremlin pimp.
Wait, what?
But his official title in the Kremlin administration was director of the International Financial Center Department. So, he was very clearly linked with bringing the Western bankers to Moscow. So it was kind of, it's an effort to show people a good time. It's hospitality.
That's wild. We've already used quite a lot of time. Oh, I just wanted to touch on one point that I think you make in the book, which is when Ike Kavaladze was opening all those accounts, many of them were never used.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating that some sort of long game was unfolding.
Well, one person who knew a bit about the investigation told me that Kavaladze essentially was using these companies like burner phones. They'd be like one-time use companies, so they'd either get money transferred through them, or perhaps, as you said, that they were keeping them for the future. They were like sort of ghost accounts that could be used any point in the future, whenever they needed to transfer the money. And it's curious to go back to some of those networks and see whether they've since been used, whether it's for funneling Trump-related money or anything else. But they certainly were establishing a presence, and and I think they were making use then of very, very lax banking regulations.
And what was he doing in the Trump Tower meeting?
Well, that's a good question, because there was no reason whatsoever for him to be there. I mean, we've seen the transcripts from the congressional hearings and so on, where he was sort of asked specifically, supposedly by Aras Agalarov, to turn up. There's no reason really for him to be there, but I'm told by one former senior Soviet KGB officer that he believed that he was sent by the Kremlin really as to kind of show up the Trump organization, and all these sort of high-level campaign officials, including Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort, meeting with these guys almost for no reason, including Kavaladze, who really, as also according to this foreign intelligence officer, that basically he did function the way he came to the US, the way he gained his citizenship, basically kind of underlined that he was, in this former Soviet KGB officer's view, that he'd been sent to the US as an illegal, that he was an intelligence asset, and that when you have somebody like Kavaladze, who's clearly a Russian intelligence asset, there at a meeting like that, then it's clearly kind of an intelligence game on the side of the Russians to make the Trump organization look even more like idiots, because how on earth could it happen that someone who's already been so deeply implicated in money laundering operations has sort of clear links with the security apparatus, that how come he gets to go to a meeting like that? And it's more of a kind of a stitch up, unless there, of course, there are still things that we don't know about what went down at that meeting, which is also entirely possible. You know, but I should underline that I have, on all these questions, reached out to Mr. Kavaladze for comment, but he's refused to answer any questions and just very clearly said he doesn't want to speak to me about anything. So
He did testify, and I read the transcript, and it was absolutely beautiful. I thought he was incredible. He's like, "Oh, I wanted Hillary to win. Like, what are you talking about?" Like, it's just so completely like, I don't even know why I was there. My boss told me to go. What's the big deal? Like, these things happen, right?
Yes, and some slight misstatements though, which he had to backtrack on later regarding sort of his movements afterwards. Because first, I think he said he went straight back to his home in California, when it turned out actually he went on quite a long trip to Moscow, where presumably he was reporting back on something or other. So, you know.
And then there's another fascinating character in your book who touches basketball, and I'm going to mangle his name, but Shabtai Kalmanovich.
You got it right.
How did I do?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm.
So Sue Bird and Diana Taurasi. Sue Bird's been on the show. Two of the best players in the world. Talk about him in reverential terms. He's dead now, but as like they played for him at Spartak and loved playing for that team. It was basically the pinnacle of women's basketball on the planet Earth, as far as I can tell. But he's just this. Well, I don't even know how to describe him. Can you tell us about him?
Yeah, he's one of the great characters of the Moscow business world and the underworld. He was actually arrested by the Israelis in the early 80s for spying for the Soviets. So he's clearly a KGB asset, but he also kind of straddles the criminal underworld as well. He's been named by the FBI as being a very close associate of Russia's most powerful criminal organization, the Solntsevskaya Group, which, according to the FBI, has been involved in drug running, weapons trafficking, prostitution rings, contract killings, you name it. They've done it. And there was an organization set up in the 80s by two very powerful Russian criminals, one called Mikhas or Sergei Mikhailov, who I'm told by one associate began as a waiter and then started pimping girls, again prostitutes, and then moved very rapidly into weapons trafficking and didn't know what to do with the cash. So they turned to operatives like Shabtai Kalmanovich and another guy called Semyon Mogalevich, who already had established ties in the West to sort of help them move money into the West and into the banking system in a covert way. I'm told that Kalmanovich was very enigmatic, that he was a great guy, but he also had very senior level kind of relationships in the diplomatic world. So he was certainly kind of a go-to person if you want to expand your international network. Now, I hadn't known about the basketball connection until I spoke to you the other week. So that's very curious. It may just have been his hobby and his pastime, or it may too have been just another way of kind of gaining a platform or a foothold in a very segment of sport. Because, like I say, sports has always been a kind of a particular area of the KGB, sort of dating back decades, whether it be for recruitment or for influence and kind of hospitality operations. Because obviously in Soviet times, that was one of the few ways available to travel.
Right. Well, that was actually Prokhorov's dad was a sports official who traveled, and according to, I think it was like Julia Iofe's New Yorker story, has this sort of, he was that's why Prokhorov was raised a little bit more international, because his dad had
Mm-hmm.
been overseas a lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's a funny thing about basketball, which is, the women in the women's basketball NBA are paid terribly, and to sort of pay their mortgages, they go overseas for the winter, where they make much more money. And that's just, everybody knows that's how it goes. And finally, I was at some event, some basketball event, and I was like, well, why do they have a better business model overseas? Like, why can they pay so much more overseas? And are the stadiums full with expensive tickets? Is it on television, etc.? And a very plugged in person there was like, no, it's just money laundering. Like, the overseas teams are just money laundering. That's what I'm like, oh, that makes so much
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, makes sense indeed. Yeah, especially if you want a way to sort of park your assets in the West and an excuse for doing so. Yeah, certainly makes sense.
Why is he dead? He was murdered, or some sort of assassinated or something. What was the story of his death?
Yeah, he was assassinated in 2009. I'm afraid I'm not really that well up on exactly why. I presume he crossed another criminal overlord, or perhaps he'd been sort of stepping too far out of the bounds of what he was permitted to do by the Kremlin. That was 2009 when he was killed, and that was really a time when the Kremlin was seeking to mop up some of the more embarrassing ties it had with the criminal underworld. Putin, in the early 90s, when he was deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, he'd worked very closely then with the head of the St. Petersburg most powerful criminal organized crime group, the Tambov group. And this was and they worked very closely hand in hand to run the city's fuel distribution sector, and also the seaport in St. Petersburg, which was a very important hub for smuggling drugs from Latin America through St. Petersburg and then into Europe. And we've seen testimony in London's High Court about that, about how basically Putin's KGB allies oversaw that industry hand in hand with the Tambov group. And it's clear, and I've also seen sort of various other testimonies and witness kind of accounts about how Shabtai Kalmanovich also played a role in that. And he was also very close to Putin's mentor of the time, Anatoly Sobchak, who was St. Petersburg's mayor. And they were very good friends because, again, as I said, Kalmanovich was a very charming guy. And it may be that Kalmanovich was caught up in this roundup that was going on then, because sort of in 2008, Putin had arrested the head of the Tambov group, Vladimir Borsukov, with whom he'd been so close in the 90s. And I think they were trying to sort of tidy up the rougher edges of their past. And also, I'm told by two very good sources that at the time, Borsukov had also been a bit straining at the kind of the growing power of Putin, and sort of how he was essentially more and more running the country as a czar. And I'm told by two former Borsukov associates that Borsukov, he had lots of also compromising information on Putin, and there may have been some blackmail going down, and that was why he was jailed. And because Kalmanovich had been quite closely associated with this group, it may be that somehow he was caught in the crossfire too, but it's certainly a good avenue for further investigation.
This is brilliant work. It's called Putin's People, and it from afar seems like there are an infinite number of Putin's people, but it seems like a bit of a small town. It seems like there aren't 100,000 of Putin's people, right? I mean, it seems like they are. I mean, 1,000 people we're talking about who are.
Well, you know, there are the Putin's people, and there are the Putin's people. Like the real Putin's people are the ones that he knew from St. Petersburg or from his KGB days in Dresden. They're the ones that he worked with. In fact, going back to the days when St. Petersburg was Leningrad, he worked in the KGB office with them. And these are the ones who are now most powerful in Putin's Kremlin, especially since the annexation of Crimea and since these more kind of progressive elements in the Kremlin have been completely sidelined. So Putin's people, the St. Petersburg KGB guys. It's Igor Sechin, who has been his henchman since the early 90s. There's Sergei Ivanov, with whom he worked in the Leningrad KGB. It's Nikolai Patrushev, who is the uber ex-KGB ally of all. He was the head of the Federal Security Service under Putin, and he's now the powerful head of the Security Council. And he's really, I'm told, there's kind of the master architect of the idea to try and use capitalism as a weapon against the West, to sort of turn the tables on the West and sort of like still have these dreams of Russian empire, but use money as a way of doing so, i.e. taking control of as much strategic cash flow as you can, and then using it to buy off and undermine Western politicians. And he's the great zero-sum thinker. He's a year older than Putin, and very often he'll be a couple of steps ahead. Sechin is about 8 years younger, but he certainly has ambitions of his own. Generally, he behaves very obsequiously, but in doing so, he'll try and plant ideas in Putin's head, or at least that's how he's acted in the past. You know, and there are these business cronies as well from St. Petersburg. There's a Kremlin oil trader called Gennady Timchenko that Putin worked with in St. Petersburg in the oil sector in the 90s. And perhaps before then, according to some sources, they worked together in the KGB in the 80s. Timchenko, of course, denies. And then there are other KGB-connected businessmen from St. Petersburg, like Yuri Kovalchuk, all these guys who have been sanctioned, Arkady Rotenberg, Putin's former judo partner from St. Petersburg, and they're the real kind of Putin's people, the closest guys, the ones who have the greatest influence on him. But unfortunately, as they've become more powerful and as their hold on power in the legal system has become more strong, then yes, everyone else has become forced to become Putin's people along the way, because they have to bow to the Tsar, they have to carry out the tasks, and sort of they know that everyone has kompromat and compromising information on each other, so they have, by unfortunately, they've become the Putin's people too. So yeah, now it's everyone.
Right. We have a little tradition on the show where the last question is always asked by Gerard Hector, who's in an apartment in New York, but it looked like Paris.
Oh, great.
Using a fake background. There we go. Hello, Gerard.
Always an excellent way to be introduced. Catherine, this was great. So
Hi.
my question is not really profound. It's just more like I'm thinking about something, and I'm wondering if you can confirm it for me. You probably can't. But in your research, I mean, there aren't that many billionaires in the world. I mean, it seems like a lot, but there really aren't that many. Like, they all know each other, right? Like, I mean, there's like, if you have that much money, you have to know everybody else who has that much money.
Yes. Is that the question? I'm saying yes.
First part.
Yeah.
And the second one is, I'm convinced that if you're a billionaire, you're either an oligarch and you do horrendous things like some of these people do, or you do kind of bad things. Like, there's no, like, I don't think there's any good billionaires in the world, right? Like, in order to amass that kind of money,
Yeah.
you have to do something, maybe not quite full on nefarious, but something shady at a minimum.
Yeah, and you have to be incredibly ruthless, and especially in Russia, you know, it's like a shark tank. So you can't not take prisoners along the way, and you have to be incredibly sharp-elbowed and ready to do anything to guard your wealth.
They're horrible people. See, I told you, Henry. We knew it all along.
That's not what she said.
They're horrible people.
Catherine, thank you so much. Honestly, I'm going to hold the book up
Thank
again.
you.
It's also fun to read somehow. You made it. It's like paragraph to paragraph. It's lyrical and a page turner, and I imagine it will be a
Great cover too.
Right?
Great cover.
Will it be a movie?
Yeah, I love the cover. It's really good. Yeah, they really did a good job with it. So thank you very much for having me on it. It's been really fun.
Thank you so much. Honestly, the work that went into this is
You
incredible.
kind of opened my mind to other avenues of investigation. So yeah, next time in 10 years time, I'll come with my Putin's People in NBA book. You're still around.